The airport was buzzing with activity. People hurried along the terminals, dragging rolling bags, speaking into phones, and checking the departure boards. Children ran ahead of their parents, their laughter echoing through the hall, while travelers in suits moved quickly, glancing at their watches. Among them, she walked with calm confidence. She carried a small, neat bag and moved through the crowd without rushing, her presence quietly noticeable. She didn't need to announce herself. There was something in the way she walked and held herself that made people notice, even if they didn't know why. She reached the gate and found her boarding group called. She joined the line without fuss, greeting the flight attendants with a warm smile. Around her, passengers chatted or scrolled through their phones, seemingly unaware of the quiet strength in her demeanor. Some looked at her, perhaps sensing something unusual about her confidence, but quickly returned to their own worlds. She didn't stand out loudly, but she didn't blend in either. As she entered the plane, she scanned the seats and found hers. It was by the window, exactly where she had reserved it weeks earlier. She settled in, placing her small bag carefully in the overhead bin and adjusting her seat. Outside, the sun glinted through the airplane windows, and inside, the hum of engines and voices filled the cabin. Everything seemed normal, calm, and routine. Then, a voice broke the quiet. "Excuse me, can you move?" She turned slightly to see a man standing by the aisle. He was dressed neatly, with a business jacket over his arm, and a look on his face that suggested impatience. His tone was sharp, commanding, as if he had every right to speak this way. The words were simple, but they carried an assumption, that she would obey without question. She looked at him and smiled politely. "I'm actually in this seat by reservation," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. She didn't raise her tone, didn't show anger, but her words were clear. This was her seat, and she had every right to be there. The man's expression changed slightly, his surprise hidden under a frown. "I don't care," he said, his tone sharper now. "I need this seat. Can you just move?" Passengers nearby began to notice the exchange. Some glanced over, curious, while others tried to pretend they weren't watching. There was a tension in the air, small at first, but growing with every second. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked at him directly. "I'm sorry," she said again, keeping her voice soft. "This is my seat, and I'll be staying here." The man's impatience grew. He leaned slightly closer, gesturing toward the empty seat a few rows back. "It's just one row back. Why is this such a problem? Move, please." Her calmness never wavered. She shook her head slightly. "I'd prefer to stay here, thank you. I understand your situation, but I am seated here by assignment." Around them, other passengers shifted uneasily. Some stared openly, watching how the situation would unfold. There was a faint whisper of conversations, soft murmurs of, "Can you believe this?" Or, "He shouldn't be speaking to her like that." But most remained silent. The energy in the cabin subtly changed. What had begun as a routine seating now felt like more than just a seat. It felt like a test of patience, respect, and understanding. The man's face tightened. He looked around, perhaps hoping someone would support him or silently approve his demand. But most passengers either avoided eye contact or watched quietly, unsure if they should intervene. He looked back at her, expecting a reaction, expecting compliance. What he didn't expect was the quiet, unwavering confidence in her gaze. She sat back slightly, her hands folded gently in her lap. Her posture was relaxed, yet carried authority. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was simple and human. She was calm, composed, and entirely unshaken by his outburst. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to shout, because the strength in her presence spoke louder than any words could. The man's frustration grew, his voice rising just slightly as he tried to assert control. "Look, I don't want trouble. I just want this seat. It's not a big deal. Can you please move?" She remained polite, unhurried, and consistent. "I understand, but I'm not moving. I hope you can find another solution." It was a small exchange, only a few sentences, but the impact stretched far beyond the words. Passengers shifted in their seats, sensing the tension. Some admired her restraint, while others felt uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. The cabin, once calm and routine, now held a quiet suspense, like the moment just before a storm. She could have argued louder, defended herself more aggressively, or even let frustration show, but she chose restraint. Her calm demeanor slowly began to affect those around her. A few passengers nodded subtly, as if to affirm her choice. Others watched closely, learning without realizing it about respect, dignity, and the quiet strength a person can carry in everyday situations. The man finally leaned back slightly, muttering under his breath. He looked at the empty seats nearby, scanning the cabin for alternatives, though his annoyance was clear. For a moment it seemed like he might relent, though grudgingly, not willingly. The flight attendants, noticing the exchange, approached quietly. One offered a gentle suggestion to help find him another seat, speaking in soft tones that didn't embarrass anyone. She thanked them politely, acknowledging the effort without needing drama. The small gesture helped calm the situation slightly, but the tension between the man and her remained palpable. As the plane began preparing for takeoff, the cabin slowly returned to its regular hum. Some passengers whispered quietly among themselves, sharing their reactions. She settled into her seat, adjusting her bag and preparing for the journey ahead. Her calm, composed presence had not only defused the initial confrontation, but had also set an unspoken tone for the rest of the passengers. One of respect, patience, and observation. Though the man was still frustrated, he had begun to realize that his expectations and assumptions were not absolute. He had underestimated the situation, assuming compliance without understanding the person before him. And though the flight had only just begun, the first lesson was already clear. Appearances can be deceiving, and patience, respect, and dignity often speak louder than any command. The engines roared to life, the plane began to taxi, and she looked out the window, watching the runway stretch into the distance. The tension in the cabin was still present but tempered by her quiet composure. This wasn't just a fight over a seat. It was a story of understanding, self-respect, and the subtle power of carrying oneself with calm confidence. As the plane lifted into the sky, the first chapter of the journey had been written. The conflict, though small in words, had already made a mark on everyone who witnessed it. It was a reminder that true strength doesn't always shout. It often sits quietly, waits patiently, and carries itself with unwavering dignity. And in that simple act, seated by the window, the story of the flight and the lessons it held had only just begun. The cabin settled into a quiet rhythm as the plane climbed higher. The hum of the engines filled the space, punctuated by the occasional rustle of bags or a soft conversation. Passengers adjusted their seats, fastened seatbelts, and tried to get comfortable for the journey ahead. Yet, the earlier confrontation lingered in the air, subtle but noticeable. Some people glanced at the two again, almost like they were waiting for a repeat of the drama that had unfolded just moments before. The man who had demanded the seat sat stiffly, clearly still frustrated. His face betrayed impatience and embarrassment. He avoided eye contact, staring out the window at the clouds passing by, yet his body language screamed irritation. His hands fidgeted with his jacket, then with his phone, then back to the armrest. Every movement seemed to reinforce his discomfort. Around him, other passengers stole occasional glances, some curious, some silently amused, but most trying to maintain polite indifference. She remained seated calmly, quietly observing the man without any sign of confrontation. She adjusted her bag beside her, picked up a magazine, and began flipping through it. Every gesture was deliberate in its simplicity. There was no arrogance, no show of triumph, only a composed presence that seemed to make the man's agitation look even more awkward. She didn't need to speak to assert herself. Her calmness did that on its own. But the man could not leave it alone. After a few minutes of tense silence, he leaned toward her slightly and spoke, though his voice was lower this time, almost an attempt at subtlety. I still don't understand why this has to be such a problem. Can't you just be reasonable? She looked up from her magazine and met his gaze evenly. Her voice remained soft and steady. I am being reasonable. I am in the seat I reserved. I understand your situation, but my position here is just as valid as yours. He blinked, as if her words carried an unexpected weight. He opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated, realizing that his usual tone of authority was not working. He shifted uncomfortably, trying to gather his thoughts, but the calmness in her response created a barrier he could not easily overcome. Around them, other passengers subtly watched the interaction. A few leaned slightly closer to hear, though they did not intervene. The tension between them had drawn quiet attention without either of them needing to raise their voices. The man sighed and leaned back, muttering under his breath, "Unbelievable." He shook his head, looking away, and for a moment, it seemed like he might drop the issue entirely. Yet, his pride wouldn't allow him to admit defeat fully. He glanced around, trying to find some sort of support from the cabin. Perhaps he expected another passenger to nod in agreement, silently validating his demands. But no one did. Most avoided eye contact, some curious but unwilling to step in, and others quietly impressed by her composure. Minutes passed, and the plane leveled off. The hum of the engines became a constant background sound, and flight attendants moved down the aisles, offering drinks or checking on passengers. She politely declined a beverage, returning her attention to the magazine but staying alert to the man's presence nearby. He shifted in his seat repeatedly, his restlessness growing, but she did not react. Her quiet endurance made him increasingly aware that he could not dominate the situation. Finally, unable to contain himself, he spoke again, louder this time, though he tried to mask frustration with a tone of reason. "I'm just saying, if you were in my position, you'd probably understand. Isn't it easier to just switch? Why make this an issue?" She turned slightly toward him, maintaining eye contact. Her voice remained calm, almost gentle, but every word carried a subtle firmness. "I understand your position, but my position is just as important. This is my assigned seat. I hope you can respect that." The man's jaw tightened. His face flushed slightly, a mixture of embarrassment and irritation. Around them, passengers shifted in their seats, sensing the rising tension. Some whispered softly, murmuring comments about how uncomfortable the situation was, while others simply observed, curious to see how it would unfold. There was no yelling, no chaos, just a slow, quiet clash of personalities. His frustration against her unwavering calm. She noticed the subtle glances, the whispered observations, and she remained composed. She did not need to defend herself with anger or force. Her presence and calm authority were enough to shift the energy in the cabin. The other passengers, some silently admiring her poise, began to sense that this was more than a minor disagreement over a seat. It had become a lesson in patience, dignity, and the quiet power of self-assuredness. The man leaned back again, muttering under his breath. "This is ridiculous," he said, loud enough for her to hear, though he tried to sound like an innocent complaint. He looked around, perhaps hoping the flight attendants would intervene or that some sympathetic passenger would back him up, but no one did. His expectation of support was met with silence, and the quiet tension of the cabin worked against him. She remained seated, calm and composed, letting the moment teach its own lessons without needing to lecture. Her focus was on the journey ahead, on keeping herself composed, and on demonstrating quietly that respect is earned through demeanor, not demanded through force. At this point, a flight attendant approached, sensing the tension. She addressed the man politely, offering assistance in finding another seat if he preferred. The man hesitated, clearly frustrated, but accepted the suggestion reluctantly. The flight attendant guided him toward an available seat several rows back, explaining the options with a soft, professional tone that defused the situation slightly. He muttered a quiet thank you but returned to his new seat with visible irritation. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Passengers returned to their routines, though many still glanced at her occasionally, noticing the way she remained calm, composed, and entirely unshaken. There was no need for dramatic gestures or loud confrontations. Her quiet presence had already made a statement, leaving a lasting impression on those who witnessed it. As the plane continued through the clouds, she reflected quietly. She had encountered difficult situations before, but she had learned that patience, composure, and dignity often speak louder than words or anger. The man had assumed he could dominate through force, but he had underestimated the power of calm self-assurance. Around her, the cabin gradually returned to normal. People read, watched movies, or napped. Conversations continued softly, but the earlier tension had left a subtle mark. Even the man, now seated several rows away, seemed to carry a quieter energy. His earlier frustration had softened, replaced by a tentative awareness that not everyone responds to demands in the way he expected. Throughout the flight, she maintained her calm, demonstrating that strength is not always loud or aggressive. True authority often comes from patience, confidence, and the ability to remain composed under pressure. Her presence quietly reminded everyone on the plane that dignity is not claimed through force, but through poise, understanding, and self-respect. The hours passed slowly, the plane moving steadily toward its destination. She remained in her seat, occasionally glancing out the window at the vast expanse of clouds below. The sunlight glinted off the horizon, casting warm shades of gold and pink into the cabin. The passengers around her, though initially tense, began to relax, influenced subtly by her calm presence. The man, now in his reassigned seat, stared out the window, reflecting quietly on what had happened. He had expected compliance, and instead, he had faced steady resistance delivered with grace. Though he did not fully understand it yet, he had learned something important. Respect cannot be demanded, it must be observed and acknowledged. As the plane continued its journey, she remained quietly focused, showing that everyday encounters, even small conflicts over something as simple as a seat, can reveal character, strength, and the lessons of patience. What seemed like a minor dispute had become an unspoken lesson for everyone present. That confidence, composure, and dignity are far more powerful than anger or entitlement. And so, the flight moved on, calm once more, but forever marked by the quiet strength of a woman who refused to give up her rightful place. Not with shouting, not with force, but with steady human composure. The cabin had returned to a quiet rhythm after the earlier confrontation. Most passengers had settled into their seats, reading, watching screens, or simply gazing out the windows at the clouds below. Yet, a subtle tension remained, almost like a quiet hum, carried in the glances some passengers cast toward the two people involved. Everyone seemed to sense that there was more to the situation than a simple disagreement over seats. The man, now several rows away, still appeared uneasy. His frustration had not completely faded, and he occasionally glanced back, hoping perhaps to catch some sign that she had conceded. But she remained focused, calm, and composed, flipping through a magazine with deliberate care. She adjusted her bag once, straightened her posture, and then returned to her reading. There was no arrogance in her movements, only quiet confidence. It was the kind of presence that demanded attention without shouting. After a few more minutes of tense silence, the man leaned toward her again. This time, his voice was lower, almost a mutter, but audible enough for the nearby passengers to catch. "You really don't get it, do you? It's just a seat. Why are you making this so complicated?" She looked up from her magazine and met his gaze evenly. Her eyes were calm, steady, and unyielding. "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But this seat is assigned to me. I hope you can respect that." He blinked, taken aback by the evenness in her tone. He had expected resistance, perhaps a little hesitation, but not this quiet certainty. He opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came out immediately. The pause stretched, and the passengers nearby began to notice the unusual dynamic. Some leaned slightly forward, curious. Some whispered softly to each other, barely audible, commenting on the man's growing discomfort and her unwavering calm. For the first time, a subtle shift began to occur in the cabin. The man's confidence faltered as he realized that his usual tactics, commands, sharp tones, assumptions of compliance, had no effect. She was not intimidated. She did not need to defend herself with anger or volume. Her quiet authority made his impatience seem small and insignificant. He attempted again, trying to assert control with reason rather than anger. I just don't understand why it's such a big deal. If you were in my place, you'd probably move. It's easier for everyone. Her calm response came immediately. I understand your perspective, but my perspective matters too. This is my seat. I have the right to be here. The man's jaw tightened, and he let out a quiet sigh, muttering under his breath. The passengers around them sensed the tension, but none intervened. Instead, they watched, almost captivated by the quiet power struggle. There was something compelling about her presence. She was not loud, not aggressive, and yet, she had created a barrier around herself that no amount of commands could breach. Then, she spoke in a way that caught the man completely off guard. I hope it will help you to know that I am on the airline board. I oversee operations here. The words hung in the air, almost impossible to believe at first. A sudden hush spread across the nearby seats. Passengers turned slightly, their attention now fully on the exchange. The man's eyes widened, his face draining of color as the realization hit him. Every assumption he had made, every expectation that she would comply without question, was now shattered. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His body language shifted instantly. His posture slumped, his hands fidgeted nervously, and he avoided eye contact. The sudden reversal of power left him flustered, unsure how to respond. He had believed himself in control, commanding authority simply because of how he saw the world. Now that illusion was gone, and the consequences of his assumptions became painfully clear. Passengers whispered among themselves, some in disbelief, some quietly smiling at the sudden twist of events. The cabin felt different now, charged with a mix of surprise and admiration. The woman's calm announcement had changed everything. It was no longer a minor conflict over a seat. It was a lesson in humility, awareness, and the importance of not underestimating someone based on appearances. The man struggled to gather himself. I didn't know, he stammered, his voice faltering. He seemed to be searching for the right words, but there were none. Every potential response seemed inadequate, small, or insincere. Around him, passengers' eyes held a mix of curiosity and quiet approval, waiting to see how he would handle the revelation. The woman remained composed, giving him space to absorb the information. She did not need to continue speaking. The knowledge of her position had shifted the entire dynamic in an instant. The tension in the cabin was replaced with a quiet respect, an acknowledgement of the truth she carried in her calm authority. For several long moments, neither spoke. The man's face reflected a mix of embarrassment, disbelief, and newfound awareness. He looked around, noticing the glances of fellow passengers, some of whom were clearly impressed by the way she had handled the situation. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that his assumptions and sense of entitlement had been entirely misplaced. Finally, he muttered, almost to himself, I had no idea. She gave a small nod, her expression still composed, almost gentle. Now you do, she said softly. Her words were not meant to humiliate him, but to affirm the reality of the situation. There was no anger in her tone, only the quiet clarity of someone who knew their worth and position. The man's embarrassment deepened, and he slumped back in his seat. He did not argue, he did not demand, he did not speak further. The realization had been enough. Around him, other passengers began to relax, their own discomfort replaced by a sense of understanding. The woman had turned a simple seating conflict into a quiet but powerful lesson about respect, authority, and humility. She adjusted her seat slightly, returning her attention to her magazine, though now her calm demeanor had a new weight. The cabin seemed to move with a slightly different energy. People whispered softly to each other, some commenting on how remarkable it was that she had handled the situation with such quiet authority. Others silently reflected on their own assumptions, wondering how often appearances had led them to misjudge others. The flight attendants continued their rounds, offering drinks and checking on passengers. When they passed by, they gave her a respectful nod, recognizing her presence without making it obvious. There was an unspoken acknowledgement of her authority, even in this small, confined space of the airplane cabin. The man in the other seat remained quiet, staring out the window at the clouds below. He shifted occasionally, muttering under his breath, perhaps reflecting on the mistakes he had made, the assumptions he had carried, and the lesson he had just learned in humility. Though he could not undo the past moments of entitlement, he now carried a new awareness, however uncomfortable it felt. Passengers continued to observe quietly, some taking the moment as an opportunity to think about their own behavior. A few whispered comments of admiration reached her ears, but she did not react. Her focus remained steady, calm, and human. She did not seek attention or praise. The effect of her presence was enough to shift the atmosphere, and she carried it with ease. The clouds passed by outside, sunlight streaming in intermittently through the window. The plane hummed steadily, and the cabin gradually returned to a more typical flight rhythm. Conversations resumed, headphones went back on, and passengers returned to their own worlds. But the memory of the encounter lingered. The quiet power of her composure had left a mark, not just on the man, but on everyone who had witnessed the exchange. She leaned back in her seat, closing her magazine for a moment to gaze out the window. The sky stretched endlessly, calm and expansive, and it mirrored the sense of control she carried within herself. What had begun as a confrontation over something as small as a seat had become a moment that revealed character, strength, and awareness. The man, still seated several rows away, had finally shifted his posture. He no longer seemed interested in confrontation. Instead, he appeared reflective, quietly absorbing the reality of the situation. He had assumed power based on appearances, only to discover that authority comes in many forms, and sometimes the quietest presence holds the greatest weight. The cabin now felt subtly different, as if the entire atmosphere had shifted. The passengers, consciously or unconsciously, had learned something from the interaction. The woman's quiet, steady demeanor had conveyed lessons about respect, dignity, and humility that loud words could never achieve. As the plane continued its journey, she remained seated, calm and composed, carrying herself with the quiet authority that had turned a moment of tension into a lesson for all who witnessed it. The man remained in his seat, subdued and reflective, understanding, for the first time, that assumptions can be misleading, and respect cannot be demanded. It must be recognized and acknowledged. By the time the flight reached cruising altitude, the cabin had returned to a state of normalcy. But the incident had left an invisible impression on everyone present. The quiet authority of one passenger had shifted the energy in the room, taught lessons in humility and respect, and demonstrated the power of composure in the face of entitlement. And in that quiet, human-centered way, the story of the flight had reached a pivotal turning point. The first confrontation was over, but the lessons it carried were just beginning to unfold. What had seemed like a simple dispute over a seat had become a testament to character, presence, and the subtle but undeniable strength of a person who knew her worth and carried herself with unwavering dignity. The moment she revealed her position on the airline board, the energy in the cabin shifted completely. Passengers who had been quietly watching now sat straighter, some exchanging glances, others whispering softly to each other. The confrontation that had seemed personal now felt significant, almost like a lesson unfolding in real time. People were no longer just observers, they were witnesses to an unexpected authority asserting itself calmly, confidently, and without malice. The man, still several rows away, looked as though the ground might open beneath him. He had approached the situation assuming he could command, expecting compliance without question, yet now he was exposed to the full weight of his own assumptions. His face reflected a mix of embarrassment and disbelief. He shuffled in his seat, hands twisting nervously in his lap, searching for a response that might salvage some sense of dignity, though he knew, deep down, that none would truly work. The woman remained seated, composed and steady, her presence quietly commanding. She did not gloat, she did not smirk, and she did not raise her voice. Every movement was measured, deliberate, and calm. She straightened her posture slightly and folded her hands in her lap, radiating the quiet authority that only comes from experience and self-assurance. Her calmness was more powerful than any argument the man could make. Around them, the passengers began to speak softly to each other. Some whispered comments of admiration, noting how she had handled the situation with grace and composure. Others reflected quietly on the lesson unfolding before them, that appearances can be deceiving, and that strength is often subtle, not loud. A few passengers exchanged glances with expressions that said more than words could. She handled that perfectly. I would never have had that kind of patience. What a powerful example. The man finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost trembling. I didn't realize. I didn't know. His words were awkward, stammering, and insufficient, but they were the first real acknowledgement of his mistake. He had expected resistance, but not this calm confidence backed by authority. He had assumed that speaking loudly or demanding compliance would be enough, and he had been proven wrong. She looked at him directly, her gaze steady but kind. "Now you do," she said softly. There was no anger, no sharpness, no desire to humiliate. Her words carried clarity and quiet affirmation. She had made her point without ever raising her voice, without ever being rude or confrontational. She had demonstrated the power of calm authority in a way that was undeniable. The cabin seemed to exhale collectively. The tension that had been building since boarding dissipated, replaced by a quiet sense of respect and reflection. Passengers returned to their own activities, but the energy in the air had shifted. People were more aware now, not just of her, but of the way assumptions and entitlement can lead to discomfort and embarrassment. Some passengers whispered quietly among themselves. "Can you believe he tried to boss her around?" one said, shaking their head. "And she just handled it so calmly." Another added, "That's real strength. Not shouting, not arguing, just calm authority." Even those who had initially ignored the situation found themselves quietly impressed. The lesson was subtle, but undeniable. Confidence, composure, and dignity carry weight in ways loud words cannot match. The man, seated several rows away, shifted uncomfortably. He was quiet now, almost subdued, as if processing the full reality of what had just happened. He had assumed he could command without question, and now he realized how misplaced that assumption had been. His sense of entitlement had been met not with resistance and anger, but with quiet, unwavering authority. It was a lesson he would not forget. The woman turned her attention back to her magazine, picking it up with a gentle, deliberate motion. She adjusted her seat slightly, making herself comfortable while maintaining a composed posture. She was not seeking attention or applause. The effect she had on the cabin was a natural consequence of her presence and demeanor. There was a quiet dignity in the way she moved and held herself that spoke volumes without a single raised voice. Passengers began to reflect on what they had witnessed. Some thought about times when they had underestimated others, judged people by appearances, or assumed compliance without understanding the full situation. Others considered how often entitlement and impatience create unnecessary conflict, and how a calm, measured approach can diffuse tension and assert authority in ways that anger cannot. The man, for his part, remained quiet, his mind clearly racing. He glanced around at the other passengers, noting their subtle reactions, and perhaps realizing, for the first time, how public his assumptions had made him. He had been confronted not just by a fellow passenger, but by someone whose authority extended far beyond the cabin. He had assumed control where none existed and learned, in a few short moments, the difference between perceived power and true authority. Flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking on passengers, offering drinks, and answering questions. They noticed the quiet change in the cabin atmosphere but said nothing. There was no need to. The lesson had already been demonstrated in the simplest, most human way, through calm, composed presence and quiet confidence. Even the children aboard the plane seemed affected. Some looked curiously at the woman, sensing something unusual in the way she carried herself. Others whispered to parents, asking quietly why the man had been upset and why the woman seemed so calm. In a way they might not fully understand, they were learning about respect, patience, and the quiet power of confidence. As the flight continued, the initial tension became a shared story among the passengers. A few whispered to each other about the incident, reflecting on their own behavior, and sharing silent admiration for the woman's composure. She had not needed to raise her voice, argue aggressively, or assert dominance. Her calm demeanor and clear authority had been enough to turn a simple seating dispute into a quiet lesson for everyone aboard. The man, now fully seated in his reassigned spot, stared out the window at the clouds below. He seemed reflective, subdued, and perhaps even humbled. He had expected control, dominance, and compliance, but what he had received instead was an unshakable calm that revealed his own mistakes. The realization had left him embarrassed, but also quietly aware that respect and authority are earned in ways that loudness and entitlement cannot achieve. The woman remained composed, occasionally glancing out the window, but mostly focused on maintaining her calm presence. She exuded a natural dignity that subtly influenced everyone around her. Her quiet authority was not a display meant to intimidate, but a reflection of the confidence that comes from knowing one's worth and the strength to stand firm without aggression. Passengers continued their own activities, reading, working on laptops, or watching movies, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. There was a subtle sense of respect in the air, a recognition that what had happened in those few moments was more than just a personal confrontation. It was a demonstration of character, patience, and the human capacity for composure under pressure. Some passengers whispered quietly to their neighbors. "She was amazing," one said softly, calm, confident, and not even trying to make him feel small. "That's real strength." Another nodded. "It's incredible how calm she stayed. I would have lost my temper immediately." The murmurs reflected a shared understanding that dignity and patience often speak louder than any argument. The man remained quiet, no longer attempting to justify himself. The embarrassment lingered, but it was tempered by awareness. He had witnessed firsthand that assumptions, entitlement, and arrogance can crumble when faced with quiet confidence and true authority. The lesson was undeniable, and it was unlikely he would forget it anytime soon. The flight continued smoothly, the engines humming steadily, and the plane gliding through the clouds. She remained seated, calm and unhurried, maintaining the presence that had transformed the cabin atmosphere. Every glance she received, every subtle nod of acknowledgement from passengers or flight attendants, reinforced the quiet authority she carried. The man, still seated a few rows back, finally leaned back, his expression subdued. He did not speak, did not argue, and did not try to regain control. The lesson had been delivered, and he had no further means to challenge it. Around him, passengers continued to reflect quietly, sharing the subtle yet powerful demonstration of respect and authority they had just witnessed. Even as passengers returned to their routines, the memory of the incident lingered. The quiet composure of the woman had turned what could have been a simple conflict over a seat into a profound example of dignity, patience, and quiet power. The cabin atmosphere had shifted, the lesson was absorbed, and the man had been humbled, not through confrontation or anger, but through calm and composed authority. As the flight carried on, the woman looked out the window at the endless sky, her presence unshaken. She had shown, without raising her voice or seeking attention, that respect is not demanded. It is quietly recognized and acknowledged. The lesson she imparted extended beyond the cabin, reaching everyone who witnessed the subtle, human-centered power of calm confidence. Passengers whispered softly, sharing the story with neighbors, reflecting on their own assumptions, and admiring the woman's composure. Some thought about times they had misjudged others, assumed compliance where none existed, or overestimated their own authority. In a quiet, indirect way, the flight had become a shared lesson in respect, patience, and human dignity. The man remained subdued, reflective, and noticeably quieter than before. He had learned something important. Entitlement and loudness do not equate to authority. True power often comes quietly, through confidence, patience, and calm composure. He had assumed he could dominate a situation, but the reality had revealed the limits of assumptions and the weight of genuine authority. And so, the flight continued, passengers absorbed in their own activities, yet forever marked by the quiet lesson of dignity and presence that had unfolded before them. The woman had turned a simple seating conflict into a powerful example of human strength, patience, and composure, leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had witnessed it. The plane continued through the clouds, steady and quiet, the hum of the engines a constant backdrop to the thoughts running through the cabin. For most passengers, the flight had become routine again, but the earlier confrontation still lingered in subtle ways. It was not spoken of loudly, but the energy in the air had changed. People had witnessed something unusual, something that left an impression without needing fanfare or drama. The woman remained seated in her spot by the window, calm and composed. She adjusted her bag, crossed her legs, and gazed out at the sky, watching the sun reflect off the clouds below. Her expression was neutral, serene, and unshakable. She carried herself in a way that demanded no attention, yet subtly drew respect from everyone around her. Her quiet confidence had done more than resolve a seat dispute. It had transformed the atmosphere of the entire cabin. The man, still several rows away, sat silently, staring out the window at the clouds passing beneath the plane. His previous frustration had dissipated, replaced by reflection and awareness. He had assumed power based on appearances, authority based on entitlement, and he had learned, in an unexpectedly public way, the limits of those assumptions. He shifted in his seat, uncomfortable, but the discomfort was no longer anger. It was the weight of recognition, the realization that he had misjudged the situation and underestimated someone based solely on preconceived notions. Passengers nearby whispered softly to each other, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others quietly impressed. "I can't believe he acted like that," one murmured. "And she just stayed calm the whole time. That's incredible." Another added, "I would have lost my temper immediately. She's amazing." These small conversations reflected a broader awareness growing in the cabin. Patience, composure, and dignity carry more weight than arrogance and entitlement. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking on passengers, offering drinks and snacks, and attending to questions. They noticed the subtle change in energy but said nothing directly. It was clear without words. The dynamic had shifted, and the woman's calm authority had influenced everyone. Even in the small, confined space of the airplane, her presence had made a tangible impact. The man remained quiet, no longer attempting to justify himself or regain control. He leaned back in his seat, hands folded loosely in his lap, staring out the window. His posture was subdued, reflective, and humbled. He had assumed authority where none existed, and he had learned the consequences of entitlement without respect. It was a quiet but powerful lesson, one that could not be erased and would likely influence him in future interactions. The woman, meanwhile, continued to sit with quiet poise. She had not sought attention, she had not demanded acknowledgement, yet her calm presence had done more than any words could. Passengers around her absorbed the lesson without even realizing it. Her demeanor spoke volumes about human strength, patience, and dignity. She had shown that authority is not claimed through loudness or demands. It is recognized and respected through calm confidence and unwavering composure. As the hours passed, the flight continued steadily. Passengers returned to their own activities, reading, listening to music, watching movies, but the impression of the earlier moments lingered. Conversations occasionally drifted back to the incident, soft whispers about the display of poise and authority that had transformed a minor conflict into a lesson in humility and respect. The man, finally gathering himself, turned slightly toward the woman, his expression subdued but sincere. I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't know. I shouldn't have acted like that." His voice was soft, lacking the sharpness and arrogance it had carried earlier. It was a genuine acknowledgement, a small act of humility in a situation that had demanded it. She gave a small, polite nod, her calm expression unchanged. "Thank you," she said softly. There was no gloating, no judgment, only acknowledgement of his words. Her response reflected the quiet power she had demonstrated throughout the flight. Strength without aggression, dignity without malice. Passengers nearby noticed the exchange and whispered quietly to each other. "He actually apologized," one said softly, "and she handled it so gracefully. That's remarkable." Another added, "I hope he really learned something from this. It's a lesson everyone should remember." The cabin, once tense and uncertain, now carried a subtle sense of reflection and understanding. As the flight continued, more passengers looked toward her, some with curiosity, some with admiration. There was no need for drama, no need for loud proclamations. The impact had been made quietly, naturally, through simple human presence and composure. Her actions had left a lasting impression not just on the man, but on everyone who had witnessed the interaction. Even the children on the plane seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. Some whispered questions to their parents, asking why the man had been upset and why the woman had stayed calm. Parents responded gently, using the moment as an opportunity to teach lessons about respect, patience, and handling conflict gracefully. In this small, unexpected way, the story was reaching beyond adults, carrying subtle lessons for younger observers as well. The sun began to set outside the window, casting warm shades of orange and pink across the sky. The cabin was bathed in soft light, the hum of the engine steady and comforting. The man glanced out at the horizon, his posture still reflective, but slightly more relaxed. He had been humbled, yes, but he had also witnessed a profound display of human strength. The lessons of the encounter were settling in, quietly reshaping his awareness and perspective. The woman remained seated, gazing at the sunset with calm focus. She had navigated the confrontation without anger or force, demonstrating that true authority comes from composure, patience, and confidence. She had turned a simple conflict over a seat into a demonstration of human dignity, a subtle but powerful example for everyone on the plane. Passengers continued their own activities, yet the air in the cabin felt different. There was a quiet understanding, a recognition that what they had witnessed was significant. It was not loud or dramatic, but it was meaningful. Everyone present had learned something about respect, humility, and the impact of calm, confident presence in moments of tension. The man, still seated a few rows back, finally relaxed slightly. His earlier frustration and embarrassment had softened, replaced by reflection and awareness. He had learned, in a real and immediate way, the difference between entitlement and genuine authority. The experience was humbling, and though uncomfortable, it carried lessons that would likely stay with him long after the flight ended. The woman adjusted her bag, crossed her legs, and returned to her reading. She remained calm and composed, the same presence that had quietly transformed the cabin. Her poise and dignity had made a profound impact, and her subtle demonstration of authority had reshaped the energy of everyone around her. Flight attendants passed through the aisles, checking on passengers, offering drinks, and assisting quietly. They noticed the subdued energy in the cabin and understood that the earlier confrontation had reached its conclusion. No further intervention was necessary. The lesson had been delivered through calmness, composure, and human presence, and the cabin had absorbed it naturally. Passengers continued to whisper softly, some commenting on the woman's poise, others reflecting on the man's humility. Conversations drifted gently, not loudly or forcefully, as the story of the flight spread subtly from seat to seat. The impact was quiet, human, and profound. As the plane approached its destination, the atmosphere remained calm and reflective. The man sat quietly, processing the events, while the woman remained composed, her presence unchanged. She had resolved the conflict without confrontation, demonstrated authority without force, and left a lasting impression on everyone present. Passengers watched the clouds pass beneath them, some lost in thought, some glancing at the woman, acknowledging her quietly with nods or subtle smiles. The lesson had reached far beyond the immediate dispute. It was now a shared experience, a human-centered story of respect, dignity, and quiet strength. Finally, as the plane began its descent, the cabin prepared for landing. Passengers fastened seatbelts, adjusted belongings, and prepared themselves for arrival. The story of the seating conflict and its resolution had already woven itself into the shared consciousness of those aboard. It was a story that would be remembered, recounted, and reflected upon long after the journey ended. The man, seated in his reassigned spot, exhaled quietly. He had been humbled, embarrassed, and made aware of his assumptions in a way he could not ignore. Yet there was also a sense of gratitude, a recognition that he had witnessed something remarkable, a demonstration of calm authority and dignity that had quietly reshaped the atmosphere of the entire cabin. The woman looked out at the horizon one last time before landing, serene, composed, and unshaken. She had faced entitlement, impatience, and arrogance without raising her voice, without showing anger, and without losing composure. Her quiet strength had transformed a simple seating conflict into a lesson in human dignity, patience, and respect. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, passengers began to gather their belongings, preparing to disembark. Conversations picked up, with whispers and comments about what had occurred during the flight. The woman's actions were still the topic of soft discussion, admiration, and reflection. Her calm authority had left a lasting impression on everyone present. The man gathered his things as well, quietly reflective. He had learned a profound lesson in humility, awareness, and respect, one that would influence his behavior long after leaving the plane. He approached the door with a newfound understanding of the difference between entitlement and genuine authority. As passengers disembarked, the woman remained composed, her calm presence a final reminder of the quiet but undeniable power of patience, dignity, and confidence. She had turned a simple journey into a subtle but profound lesson for everyone on board. The story of the flight would not be forgotten. It would be retold, reflected upon, and remembered for the quiet authority, human dignity, and composure that had transformed an ordinary day into an extraordinary lesson. And as the cabin emptied, the memory of the encounter remained, a lasting testament to the power of calm presence, the strength of human composure, and the quiet but undeniable impact one person can have on the lives of many.